with early childhood stuttering. All right, our presentation topics are what is stuttering like when it begins? How many people recover from stuttering without treatment? When do they recover? And who is more likely to recover? So in language or articulation disorders, parents come to a gradual realization that something normal has failed to happen, right? So if you have a toddler and you're sort of waiting for two word combinations or long sentences, and you start to notice that other people's kids have those things, kids in daycare have those things, and your child's not quite getting them, at some point you realize, all right, I think it's time for therapy. But it's more gradual. In stuttering, however, parents come to a sudden realization that something unusual has happened. So a child who up until they're 2, 3, 4 has been talking normally fluently, all of a sudden is no longer doing so. Stuttering onset represents a definite event marked by a loss of an already established normal domain of speech and the appearance of new, unusual speech characteristics. So all of a sudden, a child is repeating, is prolonging, is blocking, when before they weren't doing any of these things. And because of this, both parents and child may react quite strongly to this change. So this is, again, this is really different, and why parents and children can have more of an emotional reaction to stuttering than they can with language disorders, other speech disorders, where it's like, okay, I guess things aren't, coming together like we thought we would. Let's go ahead and get therapy. Whereas in stuttering, everything seemed like it was going along fine, and then all of a sudden something happens. And stuttering, developmental stuttering, or we're not going to use this term anymore, actually childhood onset stuttering, is a disorder of early childhood. The majority of stuttering onset occurs from 20 to 48 months. In fact, 85% of those who will ever begin to stutter will do so by the time they're 3.5 years of age. And 74%, around 74% of children who stutter will recover. And the vast majority of those recoveries will actually occur in the first 3 years of onset. And we'll talk about that. So, the vast number of people who have ever stuttered started and recovered before they were about 6.5. And a lot of this information comes from a book called Early Childhood Stuttering by Yairi and Ambrose. And, it really changed the way that I viewed stuttering and what we knew about stuttering, because the vast majority of research that we have about stuttering is on people over age 6.5. And those who keep stuttering after 6.5, are not the typical children who stutter. The typical child who stutters has already recovered. And I don't think we know nearly as much about those kids as we know about the kids who continue to stutter. All right, manner of onset. So parents were asked, how long did it take when the child went from a normally fluent speaker to when you were really concerned about fluency? About 30% of parents said it was in one day, that in one day the child went from normally fluent to stuttering. About 10% said it took about 2 or 3 days. About 30% said it took 1 or 2 weeks. And only 30% said it took 3 weeks or more to go from normally fluent to, truly worrying that, or thinking that they had a child who stuttered. So, in the past, it was taught that this was a very gradual process, that over a month or more, a child would go from normally fluent to, truly stuttering. And the Yairi and Ambrose research tells a very different story. All right, characteristics of SLDs at onset. SLDs are stuttering-like disfluencies, which are going to be short segment repetitions, prolongations, and blocks. Almost half of the children started with only repetitions, so they were really only repeating at the very beginning of their stuttering. Another half, almost, started with repetitions and prolongations, and only very few, maybe 4%, maybe 6%, start out with prolongations and blocks. So, woke up in the morning and right from the beginning started blocking. And what's interesting is Ehud Yairi um, is a person who stutters, and when he was younger, he was a clinician in Israel. And one morning, his 3-year-old son came downstairs and started blocking and prolonging and struggling to speak. And he had never displayed any moments of stuttering until that point. And Yairi had always been taught that this is a very gradual process. Kids start out with some normal repetitions, and it turns into struggled repetitions, and then prolongations, and then blocks. And so this kind of set him out on, a journey to try to figure out what was going on, and is this more typical than we think it is? Interestingly, about half of kids immediately have a secondary behavior, some kind of physical concomitant behavior, tense movements of head or limbs, movement of eyes, face, and neck, breathing irregularities, and again, this was supposed to take a long time, but if you think about it, if you're a young child and you're struggling and maybe holding your breath or prolonging or having long repetitions, and you've got physical tension in your throat, in your mouth, on your tongue, your jaw, you're going to try to do something to move to get out of that moment of stuttering because it doesn't feel very good. So about half, immediately when they start to stutter, will start to do something physical to try to get themselves out of that moment of stuttering. All right. When asked about onset, parents said about 63% of the kids they would describe as being mild, sorry, at onset. About 31% said that they would describe their kids as being moderate at onset, and about 6% said that they would describe their kids as being severe at onset, right? And this really matches up with that 4%, 5% number who block and prolong from the very beginning. So those are probably more likely to be the kids that parents believe are severe, and the kids that are just repeating, parents probably described more as being mild. Physical, parents were then asked, was there any physical, emotional, and linguistic stress going on when the child started to stutter? So about 14% of parents reported that children experienced illness or excessive fatigue right when the stuttering began. About 50% of parents said the kids experienced upsetting events or general stress at the time of onset, and over 50% reported onset at times of linguistic stress. So all of a sudden, a big vocabulary explosion, all of a sudden, longer sentences, conversational speech, right? Something big happens language-wise, and then the stuttering starts. And now, so I know that Gerald McGuire out in California, if we look at that 14% of children experiencing illness, he has been looking a little bit at children who get strep virus, are more likely to begin to stutter, especially if it goes untreated. And we don't have confirmation on that, but that's been an interesting sort of observation of his. So part of it could be that. I also think too, as a parent of young children myself, young kids often get sick or get exhausted. So it's not that unusual that, the stuttering would happen to begin at a time when children aren't feeling well or have an illness or a virus of some kind. And then, the 50% who experience upsetting events or general stress, in my house, we have general stress pretty much all the time. Having young kids often is stressful. And so, again, that's not surprising. And young kids often have periods when they have language explosions. And so it's not too surprising that, half the time it's going to happen during periods of, real jumps in language ability. All right, natural recovery. The majority of natural recoveries occur within the first 3 years of onset. So more often than not, the entire cycle of stuttering is completed in early childhood. Um, so who's likelier to recover from stuttering? Well, the strongest predictor is family history. If relatives have recovered or if they have not, the child has a 65% chance of following that pattern. So if the child has a relative who recovered from stuttering, they have a 65% chance of recovering from stuttering and a 35% chance of continuing to stutter, right? Now that number, right, so if there's no family history, right, the child's got a 75% chance of recovering. If there is family history of somebody who stuttered and recovered, we drop down to 65%. Now, if the child has relatives who have not recovered, the child has a 65% chance of following that pattern. So then there's a 65% chance that that child won't recover, and only a 35% chance that that child will become a normally fluid speaker. Okay, also gender. Girls are more likely to recover than boys, and that recovery often happens faster. Also, age of onset, late onset. So kids who start stuttering later, especially their fourth birthday or after, are more likely to continue to stutter, right? And that makes sense, right? If you're a 2-year-old who starts to stutter, your speech and language are going to undergo a huge change by the time you're 4. So it's only natural that your stuttering would change too. Um, Whereas once you're 4, you're talking at a fairly adult-like rate, and length of utterance is close to adult-like, and so there's less change that's going to occur, and that's going to be true with stuttering as well. So the later you start to stutter, the less likely you are to recover from stuttering. SLD trends, so those stuttering-like disfluencies. If we see a downward trend during the first year, that's indicative of recovery, even if the stuttering remains high. So a child that started out with those blocks and prolongations, and parents reported that he's severe, and then after a year, parents would say, he's not stuttering as severely. I'd say he's only moderate. That child's going to have a greater chance of recovery than a child that started out mild and after the first year is moderate. So what that trend is during that first year is going to be indicative of whether they're going to recover or not recover. Lots of therapists will report that disfluency length and tempo is a factor. So if a child has slow, easy, relaxed, rhythmic stuttering, they're going to be more likely to stutter than the kids who have longer moments of stuttering and have sort of a non-rhythmic stutter. Those kids that have sound prolongations and blocks are probably more likely to keep stuttering than those who don't, although again, research is not strong there. That's clinician report. And then another huge factor is just how long has the child been stuttering. So as soon as that child starts, if all other things being equal, he or she has a 75% chance of recovery. After they've been stuttering for 1 year, they have a 63% chance of recovery. After 2 years, that number drops down to 47%. After 3 years, that number drops down to 16% chance of being a typical speaker. And after year 4, there's only about a 5% chance that a child's going to be a typical speaker. So only about 1 in 20 kids will end up being a normally fluent speaker. And it's not, it's not too unusual to meet people who said, yeah, I stuttered, maybe into elementary school or into high school, and then it just kind of went away. So about 1 in 20 kids who start to stutter, it is just going to fall away. But that means that, after year 4, 19 out of 20 kids are going to continue to stutter. All right. And again, the majority of this information came out of Yairi and Ambrose, Early Childhood Stuttering from 2004. Great book. Highly recommend it. All right. That's it. And hope everybody has a good day.